Good morning, LinkedIn. Happy Friday.
Woo!
It's been a week. It's been a good week, but so much going on right now. I love these opportunities to just talk about something like super basic, like properties. So thank you, Matthew,
Not
for
hard.
for giving me that reprieve every week.
On a Friday
Uh,
morning, too.
yeah, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Chris. Living the dream.
Yes, we are. And thinking about what to talk about today. I had a great conversation, with HubSpot this week with some clients talking about the orders object and like how they're going to transition into that, and just like it's added like two sets of property fields, or
Yeah.
two sets of address properties to the object. So now we have address properties in more places. And um so I thought about like what should we be doing when we think about whether or not to add a property in the first place, and maybe talk about some knots and talk about some alternatives.
Yeah.
And you said you had some good stories, so I'm
I
excited.
I feel like I always have a good story when it comes to properties that shouldn't exist. I think there's a certain level, like there's a very different world to administer coming into a built instance versus coming into like someone's like, we need to build a HubSpot instance. You're like, okay, well, you haven't built anything. You can start from scratch and you can just set the groundwork. It's a very different experience when you're coming into an org where like someone has set it up, whether that person was an administrator, whether that person, I should say, whether it's some HubSpot administration experience or someone who's just like, I know how to create properties, therefore I can add to this platform. And it is very easy to create properties. It's also very easy to create properties. And people love to create properties they don't need. And I think that I think the classic example, and I shared this with you earlier this morning, which was we have a property right now that I refuse to get rid of just because I think it's hilarious, which is at some point we required people to submit tickets internally through HubSpot. And at that point, you had to affirm that you were a manager. And this property is a single checkbox field that just says, I am a manager and I approve this request. And you can click yes or no. And the first question I asked myself was like, so what happens when someone hits no? Do we throw
Right.
away the ticket? Do we ask for someone like what is the antithesis? Like, well, I built it for a form, and I'm like, yeah, but on a form it's a checkbox. Inside HubSpot, it's yes, no, or null. So what was your plan for when the answer is no? Because you made the field required, but means that the requirement can also be no. So like, what was your expectation? So I think it's very easy for people to like default to, if I need to build something in HubSpot, it's a property, and it doesn't need to be a property. And like your point on addresses is a prime example. I think we've all lived that battle around U.S. states, and I will say with no shame, we have a drop down select for U.S. states, and the only reason we have it is because people, for a long time it wasn't consistent. Like you couldn't like you states when it filled that state region property on contacts, it would fill sometimes and then sometimes not. And then you get things that are like full names. So you get California versus CA, and like you get those inconsistencies depending on what Insights was pulling from. Now, thankfully, you can streamline that. I believe now you can actually talk it off to like, do you want state names or do you want states? But if you work in a company where you have a global reach, it goes beyond U.S. states. So we still have that today just because we use a lot for filtering and for like assigning regions specifically. Like if it says any of the following states, assign it over here. And drop down selections work a little better when you're doing that, because I think the state region property today is treated like single line text. It's like you have to know exactly what it's going to say. And people love to be like US or USA. Like that's great. We're not consistent at all as a country, like what we like to shorten our name to. So
Yeah.
that creates its own problems. But I think it's very easy to create properties, and it's very easy to create something as a property when it should be something else. And you brought up a great point, even in like the intro, which is there's so many other ways now to do things. Like we have custom events, we have notes. Like you don't need to create a property every time. And I think it goes back to that whole, if you create a property, there's a level of data governance you have to maintain. And if you're not going to, if it's something you're going to use once or it's not relevant as a reporting metric, does it really need to be a property?
Yeah. No, it's been coming up a lot because I was talking with Lucy on Wednesday just to Like, what is a super admin responsible for? And like, I'm getting to the point where just about the only thing you can control is your awareness of the current state of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because while it's very easy to create properties, and I love, you know, as opposed to most admins, I'd rather empower the users to do what they need to do instead of, you know, trying to create all these rules, which inevitably you get asked, like, oh, I need permission to do this. Oh, okay. Uh, but HubSpot often, like all these updates, like sometimes they just create duplicate properties for you, right? They're not asking, they're not
Yeah.
checking, they're not following their own advice sometimes.
Yeah.
A lot of this gets created because it's moving from like integration object to real object, or sometimes
Yeah.
the integrations themselves with apps, uh, you know,
Oh my goodness,
create
apps.
properties, right?
I hadn't even thought about the pain and suffering it is integrations creating their own properties that don't make sense.
Yeah. And like the
Oh,
way that we name, because that's where like not only is it duplication of address properties already
right.
between the company and the contact,
Yeah.
but like the name of the property that holds the state information is different, right? It's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
how do we, like, you preach and teach governance, yet we have default properties not so much.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's step one, where like just be aware of what your system is in, and how it, what the needs are for your business and your team, um, so that when the need comes up, it's what is your filter like when somebody says, like, what, take me through the conversation, like,
Yeah.
you know, Matthew, I want to create this new property.
I think a lot of the questions I ask is like, so what is your vision for this data in 6 months? That's always my answer. The first question is like, cool, you want this new property. So what are you going to do with it in 6 months? Because a lot of times people will default to, and I think this comes a lot from properties are easy to create because HubSpot was intrinsically a marketing tool. And the number one thing marketers love is forms because it collects data. So like you have to create a property to create a form field. And I think it's very easy for people to say, well, I need this data. And I'm like, great. So how are you going to report it in 6 months? Like, well, if you got a use for it out the gate, like if it's something to do with like segmentation, it's something to do with, defining what sequence you want to put them in, like let's go for it. But let's also make sure there's not something already exists that does this already that we're not using correctly. Like, I've seen this happen before where people create, like it's something that doesn't exist in HubSpot intrinsically is like contact type or company type. Especially if you work in a business where you have varying types of contacts and companies. Like I'd love if anyone has a business that has like one type of customer, please let me know because I would love to work there. My life would be so much easier if only one type of customer ever interacted with your product. But I think that like in education, which is the space I'm in now, we have districts, we have schools. We have to be able to differentiate those two. So like we go create a contact type and you say like this is a district contact, this is a school contact. Um, like those serve a purpose because you're going to report later on like how many school contacts are reaching out with requests about the platform versus maybe a district contact. And you may split them up when it comes to like deals and how you sell to people because you're looking at, okay, my sales team needs to focus their energy on district contacts, not school contacts, but they respect that a school contact might be an influencer. So, to get me to district contact. So I think you can very easily say, okay, cool, there's a really good use case for this. Let's create this property so we can start to split this data and start to segment it a little better. People are often like I think the best and worst property to some extent is single checkbox. Like not to hate on single checkbox fans out there, but it's a property that creates data messes because it's just a yes no field.
Right.
It's all it is. It's just saying yes or no. And I'm like, that's great, but you always have a follow up question if you need to create another property. Like I'm always when people send me yes no properties, I'm always like, would this be better served with a drop down select? Because you can be more discreet about how you answer the question. Like you can have, like there's times I've created an MVP for something and I know I'm creating a property and they want just like a yes, no answer. And like, I'll push them a little bit. Like, is that really the answer you want? And like, I think so. And I'm like, okay, we're going to make this a drop down select with yes, no, so that I can change these in the future. Because
Yeah.
nothing worse than having to migrate properties when you're changing a process later. But I think analyzing that sort of space of like, is this not only if it is the right property, if it's the right data that you need to collect, are you collecting in the right way? Is such an important step because ultimately down the line, you're going to need to understand that data and be able to report on it. And there's limits to how you can report on things like drop down select versus single line text. And there's value in single line text. I think single line text is great. Like we've used single line text before to manage campaign names because I'm like, I don't want to go update a drop down select every time you start a new campaign every week. Like that's painful. I don't want to do that. Single line text, at least I can report on any of this. And it goes into naming conventions, which is like if you use naming conventions correctly, you can pull out specific information from that single line text field. But it's very easy to create properties without the 6 months like foresight. Even if you're
Yeah.
not a company that knows what you'll be doing in 6 months, like just think about, okay, I'm collecting the data, how am I going to report on it? And there are other ways to report on that data that aren't always a property. You know, sometimes it's, I want, like the most common one I've seen a lot from CS teams is like, well, I want a place I can write my notes. I'm like, cool, so this thing called notes. Please write it there. And they're like, yeah, but I want to be able to report on it. I'm like, no, you don't. You're
Right.
never going to report on your notes. You just want to be able to export it in a spreadsheet at some point, and you want to be able to have notes as a column. Like, let's be real, that's what you wanted. And I'm not going to let you don't have export privileges, so that's never going to happen. So let's just create notes, and that way we don't do this anymore. And then you have like access to snippets, and you have access to all these other tools and personalization that you can put in there. So I think it's valid that if you're going to be a HubSpot admin, to kind of hijack this a little bit, if you're going to be a HubSpot admin, and you don't understand the basic tenets of when a property needs to be a property, when it can be something else, I think you'll have a really hard time creating an ecosystem that is going to grow and scale with you over time because that's something you kind of have to get really good at. And like I've made my own mistakes in that before where I've built things and like this is not, I've created essentially the end state and I can never scale out of that without rebuilding it again. And I think that's the danger with custom objects. Custom objects are great. You can make them in the UI now. But if you don't think about what is the scale path of this object as my business scales, like you could be creating something that's going to be dead in 8 months, 12 months, a year and a half. You know, it's, you want to make sure that you're thinking about scale all the time.
Yeah. Oh, and I love that question of what is this like in 6 months? Because so can usually get to the heart of the matter if they can't answer what happens next. Like,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's just like, okay, I open up this record and I see this information. Like, what am I supposed to do with it? What action are you taking? Like,
Yeah.
all what context is it giving you? Like, because just so much ambiguity gets created just because we want some extra information. And so, what is the most for you? Like, what is the most common pivot from a property?
I feel like a lot of times it is like recently, I feel like it's been notes. Like a lot of it is just like, I want to store more data. And I'm like, okay, how can notes or tasks solve this problem? Like right now we just built this over the summer for our launch season, which starts next week, which means I'm going to be pretty chaotic. But for all our other teams, I'm like, I'm so sad that like my quiet time's over. I'm like, my quiet time never came. Like I was busy this whole summer. But it's very common people want to like, I want to put a process in place. And we have now our implementation object, and then we have like a sub implementation object that essentially like tracks along with it. And the only reason we did that is it's two separate teams. We have a customer facing team, and then we have like a back end data management team. And their processes are similar, but not the same. And there's a handoff between the two teams. And I was like, we need additionally to just do like one pipeline, but then it was very quickly established like they're going to move at a different rate than this team's going to move at, and we need to go track those changes. So, like, let's do two objects because then we can have separate pipelines, and they can just keep in sync. And we use associated record cards for all that fun stuff. But thinking about that, there was a lot of asks around, well, what happens when a data person, needs to inform the CS manager of an issue? Like, you collected this roster of data, and I just checked it, and all these second graders have birthdays that say they were born in 1920. Don't think that's right. You know, can we go back and fix it? How do we do that? Like, let's just create a property. Like, we create a property and then we just have it show up as a, like, because they got all excited about property sync. Like, just have it synced to their record and then they can see it. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But the problem is, though, it's not actionable for them. Like, that they can now see this data, but they can't do anything with it. They can't tell you that they've done anything with it. They can't tell you that they've completed the action, they can't ask for feedback. They're now going to go to the age-old solution of going to Slack and sending you a message going, what does this mean? Which means we're not tracking that interaction. So it's like, let's use tasks to better identify that. Let's put a task and assign it to them and say, do this thing because this is broken. And they're like, oh, that makes more sense. And I'm like, because then they can run through their tasks first thing in the morning. We can send them a notification on their tasks. They can get emails, whatever, desktop notifications, pigeon mail, whatever they want to get their knowledge of a task that's being assigned to them. And you can set a date on it. It can be overdue. Like you can do that sort of stuff, which if anyone at HubSpot's listening, please give us the opportunity to like make a better activities object because I have a lot of feelings about that. Make activities its own object. It is an object, but it needs to be a better object. Like I want to go like custom activity types. And I want to have like more than just meetings. But that's a separate conversation. I think that there's just often better ways. And a lot of people just are naive to HubSpot as an end user. They're like, they interact with the properties, so they try to solve a solution before they talk to you, which is a very common thing I've encountered. I'm sure you encounter too, but like they come to you with the solution already. They're like, yeah, you're going to build this. And I'm like, I'm not. We're going to talk about your problem first because I don't think what your solution is what you actually wanted. And 9 times out of 10, it's not. It's like they just kind of like, well, if we build this and we add properties, like we get there. And I'm like, what are you actually trying to solve for? And they're like, oh, this. And I'm like, you can just use tasks. Like that's already built. The team are familiar with it. We're not going to do a ton of training on it. Let's just use this tool. So right now it's been like tasks and notes. But I think there's a huge use case for product data. I think previously for a long time, people would sync product data into properties versus now with custom events, you could sync them as events. I think there's a lot of power there. And unfortunately, the nature of our product, like we don't have data that would work well in events. So like it makes me mad because I want to try it. Because in my last company, we have tons of things that could be events. Because I'm like, oh my God, when you close out a point of sale, that should sync to the CRM so you can see like what was their taking us for the day. But you know, there's I think there's so much option now with custom events to bring stuff in and say, hey, I want to see this and be able to see it over time. And I'm kind of mad because they brought out this new thing this week. I think it was this week. So many updates from HubSpot. Sometimes I forget when they came out. There was a beta now that's out that's update track property changes, which is great, and there is value in that. But I feel like that's undermining my whole like use events instead of creating a property. Because like, well, I can track property changes. Why would I make an event? I'm like, events are great because you can track it over time and changes over time. And I think that's in a much more succinct way than like tracking property changes over time because that really, I think, is more an audit tool and less a business use case. So I'm willing to stand up with someone and say I'm wrong on that. But I think that the track property changes is more like, I want to see how often a CSM is being reassigned to this or how often a ticket is moving back and forth between stages. Because you couldn't really do that before without creating like full properties.
Yeah. It's also like usually a troubleshooting mechanism. This data doesn't look right. Like when did it go wrong? Stuff like that. So, but yeah, maybe you can live a little through Danielle and Brian. They're going to be continuing their unboxing of the webhooks related custom events later today. They're excited about the use case that they've devised to share. But yeah, and even like with notes and tasks, like almost all of this, like comes back to like training and enablement of the teams. Like I've seen some really cool implementation of notes where as long as it's, you know, formatted the same way every time, or you use snippets or you title it the same way, now it's searchable. And so there's ways to make that work for sure. But what do you, it's often like also like if you just don't know, like you can start with notes and say like, okay, are you putting this exact information in every time? And it's always one of these 3 options. Okay, let's make that a property, right? So,
or even when do you graduate from notes to playbooks? Like I think that's a huge like playbooks are super undervalued in HubSpot, and probably could do a whole series of this with playbooks. But I think there's so much value in playbooks and how you implement them. And traditionally they've been implemented more as a sales function, but I'm like, there's so much use case for playbooks outside of sales. You can definitely use playbooks post sale. Like I've done playbooks post sale and they've been really effective. at getting like my team to be aligned. And like when you combine them with tools like customer onboarding tools like arrows and like things with that, where you can combine a playbook is like my internal reference, and then arrows is my customer reference. Like those things are just awesome. And I think there's so much value in that because it's also making you make your properties more useful. Playbooks
Yeah.
force people to fill out properties that they probably wouldn't have gone and filled out. But it makes it part of their like process rather than it just being like, hey, before you can move to the next stage, I'm going to show you 24 properties you need to fill out.
Yeah. I
It's
did a few shows with Madeline Donovan uh, on playbooks, and that's
yeah.
where it's like I'm always curious, like the balance of like functionality and where it exists, and HubSpot's like finds ways to, you got to upgrade. You need
hmm
enterprise for playbooks, right? But knowing like I've used that twice as the only reason to upgrade to sales enterprise
Yeah.
because of how powerful it can be. And if HubSpot knows that, like, why would they bring it down to pro?
Yeah, it's true. It's
But
true. The reason I upgraded to operate my like final nail in the coffin to get operations up professional was that I can, and it drives me nuts because at some point we'll probably get rid of QuickBooks. So it's like this is the only genius link I got to get it, which is like, hey, in order for me to integrate more properties into QuickBooks, I have to have operations hub professional because that's a gated feature, and that's something that's not posted anywhere in any of the operations hub like why should you get operations hub? It's like literally this one integration will not let you sync custom like and it's not even custom properties. It's like any other property that QuickBooks has decided is not necessary. You have to have operations hub professional. Like, and the best example I have is PO number. Like, if I want to sync a PO number to an invoice in QuickBooks, I have to have operations hub professional. Like, it's wild,
yeah,
and that's I think to your point. Like when you talk about integrations and how they will often create properties or how they don't interact with properties, like well, I think there's a huge amount of. I always get excited when integrations say built by HubSpot because 9 times out of 10 they use existing properties. Sometimes they've created a weird thing, but 9 times out of 10 they use existing properties. Versus like when an integration has built their integration and it's built by them, and you're like, please don't make me add 9 properties to my portal that I wasn't planning on having.
yeah.
Um,
No,
or at
that's
least let me remap. I think that's the big. If you're listening, integration app partners, please let me remap my properties because I think that's a huge thing because like you may make a custom property for something and then you pull a tool in and it creates its own property. You're like, I had this already. Like let me just map the data I already had rather than me now having to move it to this property and change like conditional logic and pipeline requirements and all that sort of stuff because it's wild how much people. I think people underestimate how hard it is to delete a property now. Like with
yeah,
how integrated properties have become, like the other day, I was like, someone's like, yeah, we don't need this property. Like we can 100% get rid of it. I'm like, cool. I went in and I'm like, okay, my first step is always mark it as view only because that way people can still see it, but no one can add any more data to it. So if you have to like move data around, you have it. But then you like go into like used in, and now you have options like before you have views, which are painful. And I've already expressed my opinions on that, so I will not bore us all with that today. You have views, you have workflows, you have records. And then you now have things like uses conditional logic in a pipeline stage, uses conditional logic on another property, used in a center card association, use an association label. It's so hard now to delete properties, but so easy to create them that you have
yeah,
to have that foresight of how am I going to use this long term? And if you truly are making something that's temporary, putting some form of time date on it for yourself. That's like if you use a tool like we use Asana, like we'll often use Asana like thing like, hey, this is a temporary thing. I need to go turn it off in 30 days. Like set like a reminder to turn off 30 days. Like make sure that you're not pulling like making this like so interconnected as part of your process if you're going to remove it because you're going to have to untangle that entire mess taking it out.
yeah. No, that's a good point. And let's be real, people. Like, if you want this flexibility and to be able to use these properties in 1,000 different ways, yeah, it's not going to be easy to delete. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of functionality can you imagine that they could just also make the infrastructure just like, oh, boop, delete, and then we just take care of all your bullshit while we do that? Like, no,
Yeah.
right? That's not. not going to get us the functionality we need. But that integration, oh man, and this is the difference between like, marketing automation platform and customer platform, right? Like
Yeah,
it's always been like, okay, this is what the marketing team wants, but this is how the rest of the organization does it. So
yeah,
whatever the rest of the organization wants, whether it's sales and they're in Salesforce or it's ERP, and they got crazy names for properties, right? Now that causes such a disconnect, like both in explaining what needs to happen, but also how are we integrating the systems? We want to keep it the same name. So we're just going to create another property. Like, and then like the QuickBooks conversation, like, and luckily I'm starting to get through to people like, so we're investing all this money in HubSpot and we know that's going to do everything.
yeah,
We're thinking about, we know we're going to grow out to change QuickBooks eventually,
yeah.
but we're going to spend a bunch of time making HubSpot shittier to support QuickBooks. Like, tell me how that makes sense.
I feel like I
Right.
want to give a shout out to like the QuickBooks integration team because they've had like the hardest job. Like I've been like constant communication with them over the past year. Ever since I
Yeah.
found out that we were using QuickBooks, I was like, I need to find
Everybody.
someone at HubSpot. And like they just launched. It's I think now it's out of beta. It was in a private beta for a while, which is like bidirectional invoicing,
Yes.
and
Totally sick.
how like simple of a request that was, and how difficult it was for them to implement because it's just not like now that we have this fully fledged invoices object, like I 100% expect my sales team to be able to just go create invoice and just like they create a quote, like they go da, 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 an invoice gets created and then that is sent to QuickBooks. And it's not that simple because QuickBooks is like, no, I need to like these other fields. And also I don't map to contacts. I map to customers, which can be a company or a contact. And like if I had a dollar for every like I feel like it's the worst integration in the sense that when you go in to troubleshoot a workflow where you've created an invoice, the error codes are just like, I couldn't find it. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like I finally discoded it, like it'll say like this contact, like this ID 79463 was unavailable. And I'm like, so that could be a customer, it could be an invoice, it could be a company. And you have to like go like play this game of like searching inside of QuickBooks to try and find like which one it is. And you're like, okay, cool. Well, I found it. Then you find it in QuickBooks, and QuickBooks says, no, this record's been deleted. And you're like, there's no restore function, so you're like, you can't bring it back. So you have to play this game of like trying to map it out. And it's like, it's frustrating, and it's frustrating for admins. It's frustrating for sales reps, and that's the thing that I find like as an admin, you learn to live a little bit of frustration in your life, like because that's your job. Like you're gonna try, you want to make it easier for everyone else, so that you shoulder the pain, so that others can move quicker. And when you can't even do that, it makes it really easy to question why you have an integration. Like that's
Yeah.
conversations that we have sometimes. Is like if your integration doesn't work a way that makes it possible for a salesperson to use it without having like distinct documentation, I think it makes it difficult. Like DocuSign falls in that category for us. I've used other tools that do very basic things. And I feel like I've been spoiled. I'm like, I've used tools before that do, my last role, we used a tool called revolves.io that does CPQ. And you can sign contracts in there or do quotes. And it was great because we just had a really complex quoting need. And I was like, this will work better for us in the long term. You would think that a tool like DocuSign is like the Kleenex of e-sign tools would send the document back to HubSpot or at least paste the sign date into a property for you. And you can't do that. Like you can't like give me the signature date. Like that's all like that's the most important date of any contract. I feel like if you're gonna administer a tool that requires agreements and your agreements are certain terms, like you need two things. The day I signed it and the day it expires, or at least the day I signed it in the term. So you can figure out the day that it expires in HubSpot. Neither of those things are passable back from DocuSign. And I'm like, what,
Yeah.
why? I
And
like
this is,
hunted down. I was like, am I just like not finding this feature? And it doesn't exist. And I'm like, it's one reason I will hopefully this year we will leave DocuSign because I can't. And like there are tools out there like and no shame to PandaDoc because they've been trying to court us for a while now because I complained about this a lot. Like they've said that they're like we do that, and I'm like, great. You can have the worst product otherwise as long as you can send me the date. Like I will be happy.
yes.
Because I'm
No,
having to
it's,
make my sales reps upload a file into the file property, then set a date, which is like every time I'm having them do something, it's a risk of data error. And it's not because I don't think they're great people, it's because they're human. Every time you insert a human into this process, there can be errors made. Someone types
Exactly.
1920 instead of 2020. Like it's not, you got to have, I want to automate things that remove human error. And like when you
Right.
create an integration that literally forces you to have human error, it's a terrible thing. And then you
Yeah.
end up with properties that don't make sense
Right.
in your HubSpot.
Oh,
So
that's where
it's,
it is so interesting to watch this data sync thing happening, and they're upgrading all
mhm,
of these integrations. Um, but you can see, in like, ERP is a great example, and this is why I say it, like, okay, when HubSpot was just a marketing platform, of
yeah,
course you were doing all this other stuff in the other systems, and we'll just get the data we need from HubSpot and then do the real
right.
work over here, right?
Yeah,
Now it's like we can get people on board with, okay, customer facing teams love life if they're in HubSpot instead of these other systems,
yeah,
right? But now we've got all these integrations that were not built for that. And as you talk to ERP companies, like, there's no respect for HubSpot, like, almost anywhere out there, right? So they're like, okay, yeah, you can do orders. Okay, we'll just send the data over. We're not gonna. And that's what I get excited when I find people that are open to, like, okay, if we focus on our customer experience, why would we leave that to a system that is not HubSpot, right?
yeah,
That's not what you're investing in. That's why I started changing the definition of CRM. Like, instead of just customer relationship management, communication and relationship management.
yeah,
If we need to communicate a date to somebody, let's not leave it in the other system.
yeah,
Because guess what? Sales and whoever doesn't want to have to go into that other system. We don't want to have to pay extra licenses. So what? So we either create like one login that's
yeah.
super good practice and everybody
SOC 2
uses it,
loves that.
or we continually train the sales team to do something they're never going to do, and then it
Yeah,
falls to like the admins or the order entry people to like fix all their problems. And it's just like, instead, like, maybe HubSpot can have some say in what these fields need to look like, what they need to be called, and then things get a lot easier, and you can set up these integrations in a way
yeah,
that says, hey, HubSpot's data model needs to be this because it's customer facing, both for the team and external. And the ERP data model, the accounting data model, needs to be this. And
yeah,
that's okay. And together, they are a source of truth for the people using them. But the idea of like digital twinning and just all that stuff, like, I've always super protective of, like, if you're gonna touch HubSpot's data model, like, just don't buy HubSpot. Like, like, if you're gonna try and turn HubSpot's data model, especially
yeah,
like, it's built around the contact record, the human
yeah,
beings that we're trying to work with, and I know all your other systems, including Salesforce, are built around accounts,
yeah,
right? That doesn't work when I need to email 5 different people from the same company at
mhm,
different points in the process, right? And then you ask me to email them, and you can't even give me a list of customers with emails because you don't track people in those
I think
systems.
there's a huge opportunity, and we're seeing tools do this. Like we're seeing there are people out there that are starting to do this, which is there's a huge opportunity in like the HubSpot app market to build to disrupt the bigger players, like people like QuickBooks, people like DocuSign, and people are doing that with DocuSign. Um, you know, these like huge like legacy tools for business operations. Like there's a huge opportunity for someone to come in and disrupt it just by having a decent integration with HubSpot. Because like you look at tools like and like I feel like I'm not paid by Arrows in any ways. I'm just a huge fan personally. And that team's great. But they did that. They wrote back and were like, let's just focus on HubSpot because that's what people are using. And like their platform is soaring because of it. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for people if you have like enough knowledge of that legacy tool to like build your own tool and like taking on QuickBooks is like a huge task. You're taking on Intuit, which we all know how we feel about all Intuit products at this point. But like there is this huge opportunity to like dominate the market and just get a ton of HubSpot customers out the gate because it's like, hey, my tool just integrates with HubSpot. I'm like, it just works. And then now you can, you can streamline all your communication through HubSpot and not have to like go back and forth between like invoice collection over here and this over here. I would do it myself if I cared about finances, and I don't. Finance is not my thing.
Yeah,
So
I don't
luck
know,
to anyone
man.
who can.
Like, I
But
think people probably stay away from QuickBooks for good reason because
yeah,
when the HubSpot team, like, that's why I think a lot of people, like, if you have a little bit of empathy for the HubSpot team that's trying to
hmm
make this product work, when they have their integrations and they're trying to upgrade it, and QuickBooks is just sunsetting features
hmm
like out of nowhere without telling them, that makes it hard for the integration to work. Right? So they're
it was
doing their
wild the amount of
best.
stuff that got sunset. Like, wow, they were like, HubSpot was like, hey, we're gonna get this, and then House Quick was like, yeah, we're gonna sunset that now, and I'm like, you have an open line of communication with us. Why is this? And I feel like this entire like thing has become like, let's hate on QuickBooks for 20 minutes, which I apologize in advance if that's not why you came here today. But the like it's wild that that's they're still standing behind this thing of like, oh, HubSpot's just a marketing CRM, and I'm like, it's not.
Right.
And people want to get flexibility out of it, and I've worked really hard with our leadership to say like, I know you love QuickBooks, but hear me out. Like the experience for the rest of our team is not worth it, and I'm sure there's probably some rep at QuickBooks like really scared of me saying that, but like it's true. Like a lot of
No, they're
times, like
not.
they're not.
They're not listening.
They're not listening at all.
These
But
legacy systems,
the
right?
the
These
legacy
legacy
systems, they're just like people
systems.
will still buy us because we are the game that they know.
Yeah.
We are. If you need a finance tool, you get QuickBooks. If you need an e-sign tool, you get DocuSign. Like because that's what people know, and I think it's just wild to me that it's such. There are tools out there. They are trying to disrupt that space, and they're just working on this model, of just like making a better experience for like end users rather than just bottom lines. And I think that is the way forward. And I
Hmm.
can see that shift starting to happen in like the app marketplace for HubSpot.
Yeah.
So many more apps are coming in. Like I'm a HubSpot tool. I'm a HubSpot tool first. You
Right.
know, I'm not a Salesforce tool that has a HubSpot integration. And like I die every time the inside when we'll explore tools and someone's like, yeah, we have a HubSpot integration. I'm like, no, I didn't ask you to Zapier's app. I said, do you have a
Yeah.
HubSpot integration? That's not the
Yeah.
same thing. I will
It's
preach
like, oh
that.
yeah,
Cows
we've
come
set it
home.
up. We've set it up for like 5 customers.
Yeah,
Like,
like we
okay,
use
that's
Make.
not.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
we have a Make integration. And I'm like, that's not the same thing. Like saying you're integrated with everything because you can integrate with Zapier or Make does not make an integration.
Yeah.
That's not how that works. So, because I'm paying a second tool to do what your tool should already be able to do.
Yeah. No, that's a
And I
good
get the
point.
appeal of it.
I think that's like to try and because there is so much information out there and all these changes. Like, how do you keep up? I think that's a good, green flag or red flag for people when you're looking at apps. What we're talking about today, the challenges with properties, the challenging with
Yeah,
naming conventions, like, like if you see that they are HubSpot only app, like they are focused on HubSpot, I would imagine that a lot of these challenges go away because they know
yeah,
HubSpot, they know the property infrastructure, they keep up with the objects. So that's probably a good, filter that you might want to use if you're
yeah.
looking to extend the platform. So this has been an awesome conversation. Always stuff to talk about when it
Oh
comes
yeah.
to HubSpot, but especially properties.
I think people don't realize how integral properties can be in a larger scale system, like how much effect they have on the entire operation and being able to really define what you can and can't do because of something as simple as properties is wild. But if you don't understand it, like you can create a monster of a CRM. And I think that if there's any key takeaway from today, besides my rant on Intuit, the the most important thing to remember is that like properties are ultimately the core of your data model. Outside of just the data model itself, like the data model connects things together, but properties are the data that you're going to pull and you're going to report on. So taking that extra time to say, what am I going to do with this in 6 months? I think is, if that's the only question that you change in your process, I think you have an opportunity to like really start to be more mindful in your scalability of your CRM. That no matter what stage you are as a company, if you're a small startup, if you're an established company and you're just kind of chugging along and iterating, like there's always room to ask those questions. And I think you should stop and think more when creating properties than people currently do today.
Yeah. And again, that's a part of it. Just be aware as the admin and know that there's at least an answer to that 6 month question,
Yeah.
right? Because there's going to be things like inbound next month where like
I, this
half,
conversation becomes obsolete in a month. Like I
right?
respect that entirely. Like we're going to go inbound, we're doing a ton of stuff, and I'm going to be like, great, now I have all these new things I need to do.
Oh, specifically this year, like half the talks are about like data model, data cleanliness, like
I
data,
know
data, right? It's exciting, but you know, chomping at the bit to kind of understand. We know something's probably going to happen with Clearbit, like in that tooling, and I think I forget his name right now, but that the guy who came over from Clearbit during that acquisition,
yeah.
it's like he's got like 10 talks on the schedule. I don't know. He's all over it. So something's
Well, there's so
is
much.
happening there.
It's I think I can't remember if it was the previous. I think maybe 2 hugs ago with Kyle. I think it was like something's coming. Like there's two types of like months before inbound. You'll see a ton of stuff suddenly show up, or nothing. And when nothing is coming, like no updates come out for like a month at HubSpot, something big is coming out, and they're all just waiting. They're all like, we can't release this because it would tell you about something that is getting talked at inbound. So I think this is going to be a really unique inbound. I think there's a lot of last year's was a very focused and there was a lot about AI. And I think as someone who was very skeptical of AI going into inbound and hearing about it, I was like, oh, right. And AI is going to be a thing at HubSpot now. My opinions have changed in AI significantly because of that. And there was a very big push by HubSpot to say AI is not going to, and I think it was either Dharmesh or, oh my God, I forgot her name. The CEO of HubSpot.
Yamini.
Yamini, thank you. I think they both may have mentioned this at some point, which is that AI is not here to take your job; it's here to make your job better and give you a different job. And I think that we're starting to see that now come to fruition with things like content generation and small things. Like when I create a workflow, if I don't create a description before I turn it on, AI now generates a description for me and
One of my
says,
favorite things.
I know. I'm terrible at putting descriptions in. I need to do it for
Right.
properties too, but like if someone at HubSpot can make that happen for properties,
Yeah.
I'll be so
Why
happy
can't
with
we do
it.
that for
But
properties?
I think it's huge now. It was a button you had to click. Now they're just like, no, we're going to actually just serve this content up to you. Like, here's a generated description of your workflow. And I love it because it
They
makes
do it
my job as an
automatically?
admin. Now it's automatic. That
Oh,
may be a
wow.
beta, but I think it is
Okay.
out live because it's in the new workflow
Nice.
builder. When you get to skip to turn on, it will pop up and say generating description and it populates.
Oh, wow.
So it
Yeah.
is wow, because
No,
it
that's
does a really good job of like succinctly describing what is happening in a workflow, and sometimes make you
right.
question why you're making a workflow because it'll be like you're doing this, and I'm like, oh, I have 26 branches, and your subscription was you're essentially assigning states to people, and I'm like, okay, make me question how I built this, but I think there's a lot of value in AI now, and HubSpot's done a really good job of setting the stage and then rolling out the features. And I feel like we have a really good opportunity this year at Inbound where they're going to set the stage for something. No
Yeah.
clue what it could be at this point, but something is going to change. We saw a huge change in Sales Hub last year. There's this big push to change Sales Hub, and it's all new Sales Hub. And we've seen some major changes there. I'm really hopeful that it's going to be something around Marketing Hub because I feel like Marketing Hub has lagged a lot in the last year, and it needs to be an object. And I hate that it was. I can't stand that you can't report on campaigns and dashboards. So like I really hope that we see like that shift coming. And I feel like I think you were on the hug on Tuesday. I brought that up and they kind of like didn't really want to answer it, which made me think like,
Yeah.
oh, is this coming? Because they're kind of trying to dance around it a little bit. But I think there may be a huge shift in Marketing Hub coming soon, which I think will be great. And I think it's the one hub that is left behind today that doesn't have. There's been a lot of investment in Service Hub, a lot of investment in Sales Hub, a lot of investment in operations. We have Commerce Hub now. We have the redesigned Commerce Content Hub. Sorry, there is a huge opportunity for like a Marketing Hub overhaul that I will be surprised if it doesn't happen. I'll be disappointed probably if it doesn't happen, but
Right.
um,
Well, that's right.
I think that's something coming.
It has to coincide with this. Everything is an object,
Yeah.
like end state that I believe and I keep hearing more about. Because, and that's the other side of the AI coin, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
AI will work if your data works. Like it will
If
not
it's
work if
connected,
it doesn't,
it needs
right?
to be connected. Yeah.
So it makes sense that I forget what the year was supposed to be, but the like year of actionable AI or something like that.
Yeah.
It can only action if the data is good. So it makes
Yeah.
sense to see all these data talks and that acquisition. So it should be really exciting.
Yeah.
And that's just
Got
some of the
myself all
things that
excited
they're
about inbound
doing.
that I'm not going to. That was stupid.
Well, I'll be one of the many reporting to you every day.
I'm going to need you to get me like a
Come go
live
through
stream
us.
of your entire time you're there so that I can
Yeah,
not feel left
the
out.
entire time. I gotta figure out the Wi-Fi situation first. It wasn't
I
great
know.
last
It's
year,
the
so
DECC is not
but
known for
supposedly
its great
it should
Wi-Fi.
be good this year. But yeah, man, this is a great conversation. We'll keep it going next week.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, properties. There's always opportunities, so find them and let's
Always more.
grow. Have
All
a
right.
great weekend, everybody.
Take care, everyone.